Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 6 of my Rastakhan's Rumble card review. This time around, we have 6 cards. Now, I am a little later on these than normal because I was enjoying Thanksgiving holiday festivities all day, but I just got back from family, so it's time to talk about more cards. That said, if you don't have time yourself, hit the quick reviews link in the description below. Otherwise, let's jump into the detailed reviews. Up first, let's talk about Princess Talanji, the troll champion for Priest. An 8-mana, 7/5 legendary battle cry. Summon all minions from your hand that didn't start in your deck. So if you're able to generate all kinds of minions from, all the different borrowing or thief cards that Priest has access to, think Thought Steals, for instance, then Princess Talanji will take all those cards you've bundled up in your hand and she'll dump them onto the board. And clearly, if you get, 6 minions and Princess Talanji herself onto the board, that's going to be a very impactful sort of play in that old like N'Zoth style, where you just play a ton of stuff and hope your opponent can answer it and you potentially win the game. Now, that's the ideal scenario for Princess Talanji. Unfortunately, I don't think it's that simple, nor do I think it's that good compared to a card like N'Zoth, for instance. Because for Princess Talanji to work well, it requires quite a bit of setup, right? You have to get those cards into your hand, okay? And what that often means is that you're sacrificing tempo to generate a card. Cards like Thought Steal, for instance, you're sacrificing mana now to generate resources that you might use later. And sometimes you have to play those resources immediately because you need to play stuff. And you have to do things and fill in your mana and play things on curve. And sometimes that's just the necessary evil. You get a minion, you got to drop it because that's all you've got to work with. And Princess Talanji basically means not only are you sacrificing the tempo from whatever card generates you that resource, you're also keeping those cards in your hand. You're sacrificing the ability to play those. So your tempo delay turns into a resource delay as well. And I think that's going to be a really big choke on Princess Talanji's effectiveness. Just getting to a point where she's a really powerful play, it's going to be hard to do. It's going to be hard to play the game and survive and compete while setting up for a big Princess Talanji turn. Now, I will admit, maybe it's not that important to get like a board of 6 minions. Maybe 1 or 2 really good minions is enough. Like if Princess Talanji just summons, like a Lich King. That's a pretty good play for 8 mana, right? You're kind of getting a free 7/5 minion. Maybe occasionally she gets 2 or 3 minions and you feel really good about it. There are those instances, so I don't think this card is hopeless. But again, it's just building the deck to support it, finding the control resources to support it, because you got to live long enough to play it. You got to hold those cards in your hand so long. All of that means you got to have time. So Princess Talanji takes a little while to work. I will also note that 5 health is pretty weak for an 8 mana minion. If she were a 5/7 instead of a 7/5, I think it'd be a lot more interesting because she'd be more liable to survive and trade and be more impactful herself as a body. But without that, that's a bigger challenge. Now, the one thing I haven't talked about yet, which of course we have to talk about, is Bwonsamdi and Spirit of the Dead. And some people probably already went to the comments and was like, Regis didn't talk about Bwonsamdi or Spirit of the Dead with Princess Talanji. Regis, you're crazy. Well, you're just impatient. And I like to talk a lot, so deal with it. But with Princess Talanji and Bwonsamdi, that seems like a natural fit, right? You take your Spirit of the Dead, you generate a ton of minions you add to your deck. All these 1 mana minions that are fully statted. You add Ysera's and Lich Kings and Malagos and Obsidian Statue, just awesome bomb card somehow. You made that work, right? And then you draw them all with Bwonsamdi, so they all instantly go into your hand, right? And then you play Princess Talanji, so that you summon all of them. That sounds cool if you think about it. Like, that sounds really promising. The issue is that Princess Talanji's not really necessary for that to already work. Bwonsamdi plus Spirit of the Dead kind of do their own thing because those minions are 1 mana. They're cheap to play anyway. Having Bwonsamdi to cheat them out onto the board isn't really necessary. It's kind of marginally helpful. You might save a few mana points, sure, but not really the reason to do that. So I don't think this is a good fit for Spirit of the Dead or Bwonsamdi. It's not necessarily bad. Spirit of the Dead certainly is fine with Talanji. It's okay with Bwonsamdi. All of it works together. Just not the reason you'd want to do it. There might be better alternatives, more important things to setting up those big plays. I don't know that Talanji gets there. Now, of course, cards like this always have a chance to be okay. I don't think it's going to work right now, but if it's summoning lots of stuff, that's a powerful play. It's impactful. It's instant. it's not a death rattle, right? It's a battle cry. So I think there is always hope for a card like this. I've actually seen some harsher reviews than I think are fair for Talanji. There might be a home for this card eventually. It has that potential. It's just probably not ready quite yet. And that's not a cop-out of me like not saying anything definitive about the card. I'm actually saying that the card has fundamental elements and attributes and characteristics that are good, just doesn't seem to fit Hearthstone at the moment. So still a solid card, just one that's not going to rock your world right away. So up next, let's talk about Predatory Instincts for Druid. A new 4-mana spell reads, draw a beast from your deck and double its health. So up first, we have some tutor-style card draw. That means it draws something specific from our deck, in this case, a beast. Which, you know, if you've played Hadronox Druid, that might sound pretty promising right off the bat. Like, ooh, I can guarantee my Hadronox. That sounds pretty cool. And I can even double its health. That's often not helpful with Hadronox. Sometimes even detrimental to your cause, because you often want your Hadronox to die. So that may not be the best example here. But you can also think about things like Witchwood Grizzly, for instance, a 5-mana card. Play your Predatory Instincts on turn 4. Get that Witchwood Grizzly in hand. Double its health to 24. That's a big guy. And then, you know, it still would lose some health when you play it potentially, but it's going to be an enormous taunt. Maybe there's a deck centered around that, right? Maybe there's a Death Rattle Hunter style build where you get some cubes and naturalizes and you create lots and lots of big grizzlies, or at least one big grizzly. Keep it around on board because it has so much health, then cube it. There are plays, there are opportunities for a card like this to do some interesting things when you can manipulate that health into a fashion that is very impactful on the board quickly. And of course, a turn 5 beast following up a turn 4 play like this on curve is a way to do that. So Predatory Instincts has some options. Now, that said, as a tutor card for something like Hadronox, I think Juicy Psychomelon might just be better on average because you can get other things with it. Clearly, cards like Master O-Card are already really good at pulling your Hadronox out of your deck as well. So Druid doesn't typically, Taunt Druid doesn't typically have trouble finding their Hadronox that often. I don't think this solves that problem. There are already answers there for it. So for me, Predatory Instincts has to operate in some other direction, whether that's beasts or big taunts. I don't know. I don't really think it's going to be honest with you. Most of the time, a 4-mana card draw is pretty punishing for Druid, a class that has tons of card draw, and they just usually draw everything anyway. They don't really care if it's a beast or not. So just drawing a lot of stuff is going to end up getting you a beast a lot of the time too. So then it's whether or not this doubling of the health is worth it. And I'm not convinced that it is. Often single target removal doesn't really care about the health total of minions. Vile Spine Slayer is going to destroy your Witchwood Grizzly, whether it has 12 health or 100 million, right? It doesn't matter. It still gets destroyed. So actually putting this health into practice, impacting the game with it, I think is more challenging. And since the card looks rather expensive, it's at a competitive mana spot. Druid has other things they like to do at 4 mana, other card draw cards, Juicy Psychomelon at 4 mana. To me, this one's going to fall short. I don't really think this is going to make a ton of sense. Even in a Beast Druid deck, it seems too inconsistent. So Predatory Instincts is probably not all that good. Up next, let's talk about Haunting Vision for Shaman, and that is a rather haunting piece of artwork, I have to say. This is a new 3-mana spell. It reads, the next spell you cast this turn costs 3 less. And then you also get to discover a spell. So you might be like, oh, this is Primordial Glyph, or oh, this is Preparation. I get to discount a spell and I get to discover something. And yes, it certainly has some familiarities with those cards, but ultimately is much, much worse than both. I think this card's really, really bad because when you break this down and you start to understand what exactly it does, it basically reads, not exactly, but 0 mana discover a spell. Right? Because it costs 3, you're getting a 3-mana discount. So there's no actual tempo gain like you might see with Preparation, right? Preparation is worth 3 extra mana. That's why you run the card in your deck. You're sacrificing that slot in your deck, that card, that draw, so that it turns into a 3-mana discount. Haunting Vision doesn't turn into a discount. It costs exactly what it costs, right? You're getting 3 for 3. So really what you're just getting is discovering a spell. And discovering a spell is often worse than just having a spell because you don't know what you're going to get. And Shaman has some really, really bad spells. So discovering a spell in Shaman is often worse than in other classes. If it's, you know, there are some options in like discover a spell that costs 5 or more mana with Arcane Dynamo. That's pretty good for Shaman because they got good big spells, but there's lots of terrible little spells. So Haunting Vision often will just be, essentially, it'll just read create a bad resource, right? And then that means you spent this card in your deck, this draw just turns into a random thing. and that's not very good. You'd rather just run the thing you want, whether that's a spell or minion or whatever. You could run a good card instead of a card that's only sometimes good and most of the time just kind of bad. And remember, the discount here, it's not something you can bank. It doesn't cheat out mana. With something like Primordial Glyph, you can get that 2, even though it costs 2 mana and it has a 2 mana discount, it might feel the same. The difference is you can hold on to a 0 mana spell in your hand, or you can save it for a future turn. This doesn't work that way, right? You can't bank this discount for later. You have to spend the mana the same time you save it. So there's no real reason to have that discount in the first place. The only way this card ever makes any sense is with something like Electra, maybe, where you're trying to generate multiple copies of a spell without having to pay extra mana. Perhaps that's a way to play this, or a reason to play this. If there are other spell synergy cards that do support that somehow. Haunting Vision is okay in that exact scenario. It's not just like the worst card in the world, but in 97% of cases, there's going to be no reason to run this in your deck. So it really feels more like something you generate off Hagatha, a card that's cool that it exists. It's fine when you find it in your hand, but you're not putting it in your deck. You're not running it. So as far as a constructed viable card is concerned, it's really just not that strong. So up next, let's talk about Overlord's Whip. A 3 mana 2/4 weapon for warrior. It also reads, after you play a minion, deal 1 damage to it. So clearly this is supposed to synergize with, warrior's tendency to play things that like to take damage. So, Frothing Berserkers, Eternium Rovers, Armor Smiths, all these different cards, Grom Hellscream, right? Lots of cards in Warrior that like to take damage. So something like this could potentially set them up nicely. We have seen other cards like this previously in standard format though, and often that 1 damage is hard to predict and control. So sometimes it feels more like a liability than an actual asset. This could be a downside. And that's probably why this weapon has 2/4 in stats. That's a pretty strong stat line really for a 3 mana weapon because that durability is so high. This thing would be able to attack into lots of small minions over and over again. So I do think the base stat line here is strong and it's important as well. And maybe the reason I think Overlord's Whip is a better card than I'm seeing a lot of other people say, because I think that's just such a good base that if you put this in any sort of weapon deck, like say a Pirate Warrior with an upgrade or a Captain Greenskin, this becomes a really cheap and powerful asset that has a total of 8 damage for 3 mana. That's exactly the sort of base weapon that Warrior might like in that sort of deck. Now, of course, is Pirate Warrior going to be a thing, or weapon buffs and Warrior going to be a thing? Really hard to say. Is it better than Fiery War Axe or, Arcanite Reaper? It's kind of brothers on either side. Hard to say, but it has that potential. I think there are some fundamental strengths here. Now, I will say that as long as Blood Razor's in the meta, I don't think Overlord's Whip would ever really be considered a better defensive tool, like a control, keeping my opponent's early game board in check sort of asset, because that Whirlwind is just so strong at cleaning up boards and setting up the right amount of damage. It does 3 damage. Realistically instead of 2. So even though it's a mana more and even though it has less durability, it often just feels much stronger to play, I'd imagine. Not to mention that if you're using the damage on your own minions to set up cool plays with cards like Frothing Berserker, clearly the Whirlwind from Blood Razor is just going to be way, way better. But Blood Razor will eventually rotate out of standard format much sooner than Overlord's Whip, so I think a card like this could eventually slot in to that mid-game Warrior spot. I don't really love the effect necessarily. I don't think that's what's going to make it good, but it occasionally could help, and I think the stat line is reasonable as well. It's just a lot of ways to attack and a lot of raw damage. So for me, there are some aspects to this card that look pretty good. I don't think it's amazing by any means, but I think it has some playability. Up next, let's talk about the Saronite Taskmaster, the new Zombie Chow card I miss. It's a 1 mana 2/3. The death battle reads, summon a 0/3 free agent with taunt for your opponent. So you're very clearly here getting a nice overstatted minion for 1 mana. 2/3 is a really good stat line for keeping something alive over the course of the first couple turns. Trades well into like 2/1s or 1/1s that you might see on turn 1, and hangs around to trade into the next round of things as well. And clearly there's a downside here. You're summoning a minion for your opponent, and it does have taunt, so it's a minion that you're going to have to deal with at some point. So that's the counterbalance. Much like Zombie Chow healed your opponent for 5, and that was a counterbalance, Saronite Taskmaster has a problem. That's why you get such a good stat line. The question to decide whether or not this card is good is how big of a downside is that death rattle. And it's not crazy bad, right? Like 0-3 taunts kind of just go away after a while. Doesn't take a lot to trade into them. For instance, if you're playing an aggro deck where you want to run Saronite Taskmaster for an extra big body in the early game, you just push through the 0-3 taunt, you lose a little bit of face damage. If you're playing defensively, using your Saronite Taskmaster as an early game body to deny your opponent's early boards, you really probably don't care about the 0-3 free agent at all. It just kind of hangs around. Except in one important case, which is with cards like Fungalmancer or other token-style decks that utilize board buffs, think like Raid Leader, right? That's a problem, because if you give your opponent an extra token to buff a Fungalmancer, that's a huge issue. That thing's going to become a nightmare really, really quickly because they might have otherwise not had a minion. So you're basically giving them 2/2 and extra stats on top of that 0-3. A 2/5 with taunt is a much bigger issue and would make Saronite Taskmaster a big risk. So I think for a card like this, it's clearly got the same strength that Zombie Chow had back in the day. And Zombie Chow was a very, very strong card back in the day. But I will say two things that go against it compared to Zombie Chow. That's that the meta looks different, faster starts in some cases, or, bigger mid-range boards in some cases. Think about Zoo, like on turn 3, you might have 4 or 5 minions. It's just, this is not going to impact that enough, right? And that might keep it in check, but beyond that, as long as, buff cards like Fungalmancer exist, that's another problem for Saronite Taskmaster too. So I do think this is a strong card. It might get better after the rotation when Fungalmancer moves out, if there's not more, obvious token, super widely played cards out there. Perhaps this gains some ground. It has those fundamental attributes and characteristics to make it good, but it's going to take a while to see that come into play, I'd imagine. So definitely keep your eye on this card. It is strong at a base level. And then finally here I have the Murloc Tastyfin, a new Murloc, and I would love to turn this guy into a new cheer mote. I don't know if I'll be able to. My artist might not be available, but keep an eye out on Twitch over the next month or two. See if we can get a nice Chef Murloc added to the animated Murloc roster. But this is a 4-mana 3/2 Murloc. Not a great stat line for 4 mana. Does have a cool death rattle, draw 2 Murlocs from your deck. But unfortunately for a card like this, I think that's just way too slow for the traditional Murloc style of play. They usually want to dump a ton of dudes onto the board, have them buff each other, and race their opponent to death with lots and lots of aggression. A 4-mana 3/2 that has a delayed card draw really doesn't serve that purpose all that well. Like, yes, getting 2 specific cards drawn for 4 mana with a body attached is good. That's great, Think about Elven Minstrel, a 4-mana 3/2 that draws you a couple cards. But the big difference is that one happens immediately. This one happens on a delay. And Murlocs often aren't that great at like reloading a board. So if you play this guy to get more resources and he's not impactful enough because he just has a small body, and a turn 4 play when you're playing a 2 elf minion is not great. If you're not getting something immediately, he's not going to reload fast enough, right? And that's just, Elven Minstrel can work because not all rogues are looking to win the game on turn 4. A lot of Murloc decks are looking to either win the game or put themselves in a really favorable position on turn 4. They need that tempo and that pressure to keep going. And Murloc Tastyfin doesn't do that. It's not a good follow-up card. It's this sort of backup plan, secondary resource card. And unless Murlocs completely change their style of play, it's just not going to fit that well with what the tribe likes to do. Now, you may want to ask, could I run this outside of a Murloc deck? Could this just be a value card draw card, Regis? Maybe. If there's a Death Rattle synergy deck that has a reason to run other Murlocs, it could definitely be a great way to tutor and thin out your deck. We've seen things like Shaman in the past run Burlock successfully. Those were nice to get out of your deck. So that could be a thing. Maybe if you're just really looking for Burlocks and Shaman, there might be other examples. Maybe a Death Rattle Priest finds a Murloc they want to play. I think it's unlikely, but it's possible. So not a terrible, terrible card. There are ways for it to work, just not the way you'd expect it to in a Murloc deck, and it's going to be hard to find that value for it. So a big challenge for this card to see play. Okay, folks, and that wraps it up for all 6 of those cards. Now let's do some quick reviews. Princess Talanji is a 3-star card. Predatory Instincts is a 2-star card. Haunting Vision is a 2-star card. Overlords Whip is a 3-star card. Saronite Taskmaster is a 4-star card. Murloc Tastyfin is a 2-star card. There you go, folks. Part 6 of my Rastakhan's Rumble card review is done. I have to admit, these were a little bit weaker than what we've seen so far, but a couple cards with some fringe playability, I think. Might see a Talanji and Overlords Whip in a deck here or there. Taskmaster might come along eventually. So still, the overall power level for Rastakhans is crazy high. And that's exciting. I'm still super pumped about the expansion. So even a small, tiny little drop here in the quality of the cards, or at least the power level of the cards, is nothing to be alarmed about. I think we have a really, really cool expansion coming. That said, if you guys disagree, have different thoughts, different opinions, please share those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.